Part 1. The Morning That Changed Everything. What if I told you that somewhere in the fields of France, a soldier is still fighting World War I, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing man who wakes up every morning to the same artillery bombardment, the same screams, the same death? What if I told you that for him, November 11th, 1918 never came? This is the story of Private James McKinnon and the day that war forgot to end. It begins like every war story does, with hope. James was 22 years old, fresh-faced from the rolling hills of Scotland, when he first set foot in the trenches of Passchendaele. The year was 1917, and like every young man who'd never seen battle, he believed in honor, in glory, in coming home a hero. He carried letters from his sweetheart Mary, pictures of his family, and a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who'd never seen war but had died peacefully in his own bed. James would have given anything for such a death. The morning it happened, the morning everything changed, started with the smell of sulfur and wet earth. October 15th, 1917. The date burned itself into James's memory like a brand, though he wouldn't understand why until much later. He woke to the sound of shells whistling overhead, the ground shaking beneath his muddy blanket, and Corporal Davies shaking his shoulder. "Up, McKinnon! Fritz has given us hell this morning." James rolled over in the trench, his bones aching from sleeping on wooden planks over freezing mud. Around him, his mates were stirring. Tommy Henderson from London, who never stopped talking about his mother's meat pies. Big Jim Sullivan from Ireland, who could carry 2 wounded men at once. And quiet Peter Walsh, who wrote poetry in a little black notebook and never let anyone read it. These were his brothers, his family, the men he would die for. And die for them he would, again and again and again. The bombardment that morning was heavier than usual. The German artillery had found their range, and shells were falling like deadly rain all around their position. James pressed himself against the muddy wall of the trench, holding his rifle close to his chest, counting the seconds between impacts. "How long do you think this'll last?" Tommy shouted over the noise, his young face pale with fear. "Long as it takes," Davies replied, checking his watch. "Orders are to hold this line at all costs. Jerry's planning something big." He was right. At exactly 800 hours, the shelling stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It meant only one thing. "Over the top, boys! For king and country!" Davies screamed. James hauled himself up the ladder, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, his first real charge into no man's land. The wire had been cut by the artillery, or so they'd been told. Intelligence said the German positions were weakened, ready to fall. Intelligence, James would learn, was often wrong. The moment his boots hit the crater-scarred earth above the trench, machine gun fire erupted from the German lines. The distinctive rat-tat-tat of a Maxim gun, followed by another, then another. The air filled with the whistle and crack of bullets, the screams of men, the wet thud of lead meeting flesh. Tommy Henderson made it 10 yards before a bullet took him in the chest. He fell backward into a shell hole, calling for his mother with blood frothing from his mouth. Big Jim Sullivan charged toward the German wire, roaring like a madman, until a burst from a machine gun nearly cut him in half. Peter Walsh just disappeared. One moment he was running beside James, the next he was simply gone, erased by a direct hit from a mortar shell. But James kept running, through the smoke and screams, through the bullets and the blood, driven by something stronger than fear. Love for his fallen brothers, rage at their senseless deaths, and a desperate need to make their sacrifice mean something. He made it to the German wire. Somehow, impossibly, he made it through the killing field that had claimed so many others. His bayonet found German flesh. His rifle spoke death in the gray morning light. For a few precious minutes, he pushed the enemy back, carved out a small victory from the jaws of defeat. Then he saw the sniper, hidden in a bombed-out church tower, barely visible through the scope's glint. The German soldier was young, probably no older than James himself, with steady hands and careful aim. Their eyes met across the battlefield for just a moment. Two young men who should have been farmers, or shopkeepers, or fathers, reduced to this moment of kill or be killed. The sniper's rifle cracked. James felt the bullet punch through his chest like a sledgehammer blow. Hot blood filled his mouth as he fell backward into the mud. The sky above was gray and empty. No sun to warm his face as his life drained away. He thought of Mary, of her letters tucked against his heart. He thought of his mother, probably making breakfast right now in their little kitchen. He thought of his grandfather's watch still ticking in his pocket, marking seconds that no longer mattered. As darkness closed in, James's last coherent thought was a prayer, not for himself, but for his friends. Let their deaths mean something. Let this war end. Let no one else have to die in this God-forsaken place. Then the world went black. And then James woke up. The smell of sulfur and wet earth filled his nostrils. Shells whistled overhead, and the ground shaked beneath his muddy blanket, and Corporal Davies was shaking his shoulder. "Up, McKinnon! Fritz has given us hell this morning." James rolled over in the trench, his bones aching from sleeping on wooden planks over freezing mud. Around him his mates were stirring. Tommy Henderson from London, who never stopped talking about his mother's meat pies. Big Jim Sullivan from Ireland, who could carry 2 wounded men at once. And quiet Peter Walsh, who wrote poetry in a little black notebook and never let anyone read it. These were his brothers, his family, the men he would die for. And die for them he would, again and again and again. The bombardment that morning was heavier than usual. The German artillery had found their range, and shells were falling like deadly rain all around their position. James pressed himself against the muddy wall of the trench, holding his rifle close to his chest, counting the seconds between impacts. "How long do you think this'll last?" Tommy shouted over the noise, his young face pale with fear. "Long as it takes," Davies replied, checking his watch. "Orders are to hold this line at all costs. Jerry's planning something big." He was right. At exactly 800 hours, the shelling stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It meant only one thing. "Over the top, boys! For king and country!" Davies screamed. James hauled himself up the ladder, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, his first real charge into no man's land. The wire had been cut by the artillery, or so they'd been told. Intelligence said the German positions were weakened, ready to fall. Intelligence, James would learn, was often wrong. The moment his boots hit the crater-scarred earth above the trench, machine gun fire erupted from the German lines, the distinctive rat-tat-tat of a Maxim gun, followed by another, then another. The air filled with the whistle and crack of bullets, the screams of men, the wet thud of lead meeting flesh. Tommy Henderson made it 10 yards before a bullet took him in the chest. He fell backward into a shell hole, calling for his mother with blood frothing from his mouth. Big Jim Sullivan charged toward the German wire, roaring like a madman, until a burst from a machine gun nearly cut him in half. Peter Walsh just disappeared. One moment he was running beside James, the next he was simply gone, erased by a direct hit from a mortar shell. But James kept running, through the smoke and screams, through the bullets and the blood, driven by something stronger than fear. Love for his fallen brothers, rage at their senseless deaths, and a desperate need to make their sacrifice mean something. He made it to the German wire. Somehow, impossibly, he made it through the killing field that had claimed so many others. His bayonet found German flesh. His rifle spoke death in the gray morning light. For a few precious minutes, he pushed the enemy back, carved out a small victory from the jaws of defeat. Then he saw the sniper, hidden in a bombed-out church tower, barely visible through the scope's glint. The German soldier was young, probably no older than James himself, with steady hands and careful aim. Their eyes met across the battlefield for just a moment. Two young men who should have been farmers, or shopkeepers, or fathers, reduced to this moment of kill or be killed. The sniper's rifle cracked. James felt the bullet punch through his chest like a sledgehammer blow. Hot blood filled his mouth as he fell backward into the mud. The sky above was gray and empty. No sun to warm his face as his life drained away. He thought of Mary, of her letters tucked against his heart. He thought of his mother, probably making breakfast right now in their little kitchen. He thought of his grandfather's watch still ticking in his pocket, marking seconds that no longer mattered. As darkness closed in, James' last coherent thought was a prayer, not for himself, but for his friends. Let their deaths mean something. Let this war end. Let no one else have to die in this God-forsaken place. Then the world went black. And then James woke up. The smell of sulfur and wet earth filled his nostrils. Shells whistled overhead, and the ground shook beneath his muddy blanket. Corporal Davies was shaking his shoulder. "Up the cannon! Fritz has given us hell this morning." James sat up, his heart racing. He looked around wildly. There was Tommy Henderson, alive and whole, complaining about the cold. There was Big Jim Sullivan, cleaning his rifle. There was Peter Walsh, writing in his little black notebook. All alive, all exactly as they had been. But that was impossible. James had watched them die. He had held Tommy as he bled out in that shell hole. He had seen Big Jim cut down by machine gun fire. He had watched Peter vanish in a puff of smoke and flame. "You all right, mate?" Tommy asked, noticing James' pale, shocked expression. "Look like you've seen a ghost." James touched his chest where the sniper's bullet had torn through him. Nothing. No wound, no pain, no blood. His uniform was intact, his rifle clean and ready. Even his grandfather's watch was still ticking in his pocket, showing 0630 hours, the same time he'd woken up before. James started to speak, then stopped. How could he explain what had happened? How could he tell them they were all going to die in less than 2 hours, that their charge would fail, that their sacrifice would be meaningless, that he had already lived through their deaths once? He couldn't, not yet, not until he understood what was happening to him. So instead, James McKinnon prepared to live through hell all over again, carrying the terrible knowledge of what was to come. He didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. He didn't know that he would watch his friends die 1,000 times, that he would fail to save them 1,000 ways, that he would slowly go mad with the weight of infinite grief. All he knew was that somehow, impossibly, he had been given a second chance, and he was going to use it to save the men he loved, no matter the cost to his sanity or his soul. The morning that changed everything was about to begin again, and James McKinnon was going to fight it, one loop at a time, until he found a way to break the cycle that trapped them all in this moment of endless war. But first, he had to survive the next 2 hours again.
Part 2. When death became a stranger. Have you ever tried to convince someone of their own death? Have you ever looked into the eyes of a friend and seen them whole and laughing, knowing that in exactly 93 minutes you'll be holding their broken body as life drains from their eyes? James McKinnon learned that madness doesn't come all at once. It seeps in slowly, like poison gas through a broken mask, one failed rescue at a time. The second time through, James thought he could save them all. He knew the exact timing now. The bombardment would last until 0800. Tommy would make his joke about his mother's meat pies at 0742. Big Jim would clean his rifle 3 times before the order came. Peter would write exactly 17 lines in his notebook, then close it with a small smile. Davies would check his watch 4 times in the final 10 minutes, his hand trembling just slightly, a tell James had missed the first time. And at 0800, they would all climb that ladder into hell. But this time, James had a plan. "Listen to me," he said urgently, as the shelling thundered around them. "When we go over, don't head straight for the wire. There's a shell hole about 20 yards to the left. It has cover from the machine gun nest." Tommy laughed, but it was strained. "You planning our route already, McKinnon? Haven't even seen Fritz yet." "I'm serious." James grabbed Tommy's arm. "Promise me you'll go left, all of you. The direct route is suicide." Big Jim looked at him strangely. "How would you know that, lad? You've never been over the top before." The question hung in the air like smoke. How could James explain that he'd already lived through their deaths, that he'd already failed them once? He couldn't. So instead, he lied. "Just a feeling," he said weakly. "Promise me." They promised, the way soldiers promise each other impossible things. They promised to write home, to survive the war, to meet up in London when it was all over. Empty promises that felt like prayers. At 0800, Davies screamed the order, and once again they climbed toward death. This time, James stayed close to his friends. This time, he guided them toward that shell hole he remembered. For a few precious moments, it seemed to work. Tommy made it past his death spot. Big Jim roared his battle cry and kept running. Peter clutched his notebook and followed James's lead. They reached the shell hole together, all 4 of them, gasping and alive. James felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought tears to his eyes. He could do this. He could change things. He could save them. That's when the mortar shell landed directly in their hiding spot. The explosion was instantaneous, absolute. One moment James was crouched beside his friends, the next he was flying through the air. His eardrums burst, his vision white with pain. When he landed, pieces of his friends were scattered around him like broken dolls. Tommy's arm, Peter's notebook, pages fluttering in the wind like dying birds. Big Jim's rifle, bent and twisted beyond recognition. James crawled through the mud and blood, screaming names that would never answer again. The sniper's bullet found him as he knelt over what remained of his squad, and once again, darkness claimed him. And once again, he woke up. "Up, McKinnon! Fritz is giving us hell this morning!" The third time broke something inside James's mind. He tried a different approach, keeping them in the trench altogether. He faked a leg injury, groaning and clutching his knee as Davies called for the charge. If he couldn't go, maybe they'd stay with him. Maybe concern for a wounded friend would keep them safe. It worked in a way. They stayed behind as the rest of the company went over the top. But staying in the trench just gave the German artillery more time to find their range. A direct hit from a howitzer shell turned their safe haven into a tomb. James watched his friends die anyway, crushed under tons of earth and timber, their screams cut short by the weight of the collapsing trench. The 4th time, he tried warning Davies about the machine gun nests. The 5th time, he sabotaged his own rifle so he couldn't fight effectively. The 6th time, he started a fight with Big Jim, hoping to get them both arrested and kept out of the battle. Each time, death found them anyway. Death was patient, creative, relentless. If it couldn't take them one way, it would take them another. Sniper bullets, shell fragments, poison gas that drifted in on the morning breeze. Death had 1,000 faces, and James was learning every one of them. By the 10th loop, James stopped trying to explain. He stopped begging them to listen, stopped making desperate plans. Instead, he began to study the battlefield like a scholar studies a text, memorizing every detail, every variable, searching for the one combination that might save them all. He learned that the German sniper had a scar above his left eye from shrapnel. He learned that the machine gun crew in the second nest was down to their last belt of ammunition. He learned that there was a gap in the barbed wire exactly 43 yards from their starting position, hidden by a slight rise in the ground. He learned the names of enemy soldiers he killed, heard them cry out for their mothers in German as they died. Most importantly, he learned that Peter Walsh wasn't just writing poetry in that black notebook. He was writing letters to a girl named Anna, letters he would never send, words of love that would die with him in the mud. "She has eyes like summer rain," Peter had written on the page James glimpsed during the 15th loop. "If I die here, I hope someone will tell her that she made me believe in beauty, even in this place of ugliness and death." James memorized every word. Someone should remember Peter's love, even if Peter himself couldn't survive to speak it. The loops began to blur together. 20, 30, 50 times James watched his friends die. He tried every combination, every possible strategy. He saved Tommy only to watch Big Jim die. He saved Big Jim only to watch Peter disappear in a shell burst. He saved Peter only to watch Tommy choke on poison gas that the wind had shifted to carry into their position. It was like holding water in his hands. Every time he thought he had it, life slipped through his fingers. By the 70th loop, James had stopped sleeping. Even when he was unconscious in the trench, his mind was working, planning, calculating. He knew the exact second each shell would fall. He could predict Davy's words before the corporal spoke them. He had memorized every mud puddle, every broken piece of equipment, every stain on the trench wall.
He had become a ghost, haunting his own life. The worst part wasn't the dying, though that was agony enough. The worst part was the forgetting. Each morning, his friends woke up fresh and new, with no memory of their previous deaths. They cracked the same jokes, made the same observations, showed the same small acts of kindness that had made James love them in the first place. But James remembered everything, every scream, every last word, every time Tommy called for his mother, every time Big Jim tried to joke, even as blood filled his lungs, every time Peter clutched his notebook like a shield that couldn't protect him. James became a library of their deaths, a walking memorial to men who didn't even know they needed to be remembered. On the 100th loop, something inside James finally snapped. He stood up in the middle of the bombardment, shells exploding all around him, and laughed. He laughed until tears streamed down his face, until his throat was raw, until Davies and the others stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. "What's so funny, McKinnon?" Davies demanded. James wiped his eyes and looked at his friends. Beautiful, doomed, precious friends who would be dead in an hour and 27 minutes. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Everything. I just realized something." "What's that?" James picked up his rifle, checked the chamber, and smiled a smile that had seen too much death to hold any real warmth. "Death isn't the enemy here. Time is. Death just does what it's told. But time is the warden of this prison, and I'm going to find a way to kill it." Davies frowned. "You're talking nonsense, lad." "Maybe," James said, "but nonsense is all I have left." As he spoke, James was already calculating, already planning. If he couldn't save them by changing tactics, maybe he could save them by understanding the trap itself. Somewhere in the mechanics of this endless morning, there had to be a key, a way out, a weakness in whatever force kept dragging them to this moment of horror. He just had to find it before the weight of infinite grief crushed what remained of his sanity. The shells were still falling, but James no longer heard them as sounds of war. He heard them as the ticking of a broken clock, marking moments that repeated forever, counting down to deaths that would never stick. Time had made him its prisoner. But prisoners could escape, they just had to be willing to pay the price. And James McKinnon had already paid it 100 times over. What was once more? The morning that changed everything was about to begin again. But this time, James wasn't just going to fight the Germans. He was going to fight eternity itself.
Part 3. The weight of infinite sacrifice. What does it mean to love someone when you've watched them die 300 times? When you know every word they'll speak before they say it, every gesture they'll make before they make it. When their face in sleep is as familiar to you as your own reflection, but they look at you each morning like you're a stranger. James McKinnon learned that love doesn't die, even when everything else does. It just transforms into something harder, sharper, more desperate than the human heart was ever meant to carry. By the 200th loop, James had stopped being entirely human. He could predict everything now with mathematical precision. At 06:34, Tommy would scratch his left ear and complain about the lice. At 06:41, Big Jim would mention his sister's wedding back in Dublin. At 06:47, Peter would pause in his writing, stare at the gray sky, and whisper the name Anna so softly that only James could hear it. James had become a prophet of the mundane, an oracle of the ordinary moments that made up the last hour and 34 minutes of his friends' lives. But prophecy without the power to change fate is just another form of torture. "You're different today, McKinnon," Davies observed during Loop 207, studying James's face with concern. "Something in your eyes." James almost laughed. If Davies could see what was really in his eyes, the weight of 200 mornings, the memory of 600 deaths, the accumulated grief of watching the same 4 men die in every conceivable way, it would drive the corporal mad. "Just thinking about home," he lied, the words automatic now. But home was becoming harder to remember. Mary's face was fading, replaced by the hyper-vivid details of this single morning. His mother's voice was being drowned out by the sound of artillery. Even his grandfather's stories seemed less real than the precisely timed sequence of events that would unfold in the next 90 minutes. James was forgetting how to be a person who existed outside this moment. On Loop 215, he tried something different. Instead of fighting the battle, he spent the entire morning talking to his friends. Really talking. He asked Tommy about his mother's recipes, not just the meat pies, but the way she hummed while she cooked. He listened to Big Jim's stories about growing up poor in Dublin, how he'd learned to fight by scrapping with older boys who called him names he wouldn't repeat. He sat beside Peter and watched him write, noting the way the young poet's face softened when he thought about Anna. For one precious morning, James tried to live instead of just survive. It was the most beautiful morning of his life and the most heartbreaking, because he knew, with the terrible certainty of experience, that at 0800, Davies would still call for the charge. At 0801:23, Tommy would still take that first bullet. At 0801:45, Big Jim would still die roaring defiance. At 0802:12, Peter would still vanish in smoke and flame. But at least that morning, James truly knew who he was mourning. Loop 250 brought a new kind of madness. James began talking to the dead, not his friends. They weren't dead yet, wouldn't be dead for another hour. He talked to all the other versions of them. The Tommy who had died of poison gas, the Big Jim who had been cut down charging the wire, the Peter whose notebook was scattered across no man's land in bloody fragments. "I'm sorry," he whispered to invisible ghosts while his living friends slept. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I can't let you rest." Because that's what James was beginning to understand. Each death didn't erase the previous ones. It added to them. Somewhere in the space between seconds, in the quantum mechanics of whatever force had trapped him here, all those deaths existed simultaneously. James wasn't just watching his friends die repeatedly. He was forcing them to die repeatedly by being unable to break the cycle. He was their executioner, disguised as their would-be savior. The realization nearly broke him completely. Loop 300 was when James stopped pretending he was still fighting a war. The Germans across no man's land, the strategy, the objectives, none of it mattered anymore. This wasn't about territory or nations or the grand sweep of history. This was about 4 young men who deserved better than to be trapped forever in the worst moment of their lives. This was about love and what a man will do when love becomes infinite and impossible. James began to study the loop itself instead of the battle. He examined every sensation, every detail, looking for the edges of his prison. He discovered that his memories from previous loops remained intact, but his physical condition reset each morning. Wounds healed, exhaustion vanished. Even his emotional state returned to a baseline of pre-battle nerves and camaraderie. Everything reset except his mind. His mind was accumulating everything, storing it like a broken dam that could only fill up, never drain. On loop 325, he made a terrifying discovery. He was starting to remember things that hadn't happened to him. Fragments of other soldiers' experiences, other battles, other deaths, the German sniper's memories of his village in Bavaria, a French farmer's last moments before a shell took his farmhouse, an English nurse's despair as she watched boys die in a field hospital. The loop wasn't just trapping him, it was making him into a repository of war itself. Every death, every moment of suffering, every act of courage or cowardice was being poured into his consciousness like water into a cup that refused to overflow. James was becoming a living memorial to every soul lost in the Great War. "Who are you talking to, lad?" Big Jim asked one morning, catching James mid-conversation with the memory of a French artillery officer who had died at Verdun. James looked up, his eyes wild. "Everyone," he said simply. "I'm talking to everyone who died. They're all here, Jim. All of them. Can't you hear them screaming?" His friends exchanged worried glances. In their timeline, James was having his first breakdown. They couldn't know it was his 400th. Loop 400 brought clarity, sharp and terrible as a blade. James realized he'd been thinking about the problem wrong. He couldn't save his friends by preventing their deaths. The loop wouldn't allow it. Every time he tried, fate just found another way. But what if he wasn't supposed to prevent their deaths at all?
What if he was supposed to make their deaths mean something? The thought hit him like revelation. James began paying attention to different details. The German positions weren't random. They were protecting something. A supply depot, maybe, or a communication line. The attack wasn't pointless. It was meant to buy time for a larger offensive, to draw German resources away from where they were really needed. His friends' deaths, horrific as they were part of a larger tapestry, and James, with his infinite memory of this single morning, might be the only one who could see the full pattern. Loop 450 was when James stopped trying to save everyone and started trying to save the right someone. He studied the German sniper with new eyes, the young man who killed him at the end of every loop. Hans, his name was. James had learned it during one of the memory bleeds. Hans Kruger, from a village near Munich, who had a sister named Greta and a mother who baked apple strudel. Hans, who cried after every kill when he thought no one could see. Hans, who wrote letters to his father but never sent them because the old man had disowned him for joining the army. Hans, who was just as trapped in this moment as James was. On Loop 475, instead of charging toward the German lines, James did something unprecedented. He stood up in the middle of no man's land, threw down his rifle, and began walking slowly toward Hans's position with his hands raised. "Nicht schießen!" James called out in German he'd somehow learned from the memory bleeds. "Don't shoot!" For a moment, everything stopped. The entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath as a British soldier walked unarmed through the killing field, calling out in the enemy's language. Other German soldiers held their fire, unsure what to make of this bizarre development. James reached the bombed-out church where Hans was positioned. He climbed the broken stairs slowly, his hands still raised, until he found himself face to face with the young German sniper who had killed him hundreds hundreds of times. Hans's rifle was trained on James's chest, but his hands were shaking. "Warum?" Hans whispered. "Why?" James looked into the young German eyes. Blue eyes, he noticed. Blue like the sky above his grandfather's farm in Scotland. "Because," James said softly, "someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to choose mercy over madness." He held out his hand. "My name is James McKinnon. I'm 22 years old. I have a sweetheart named Mary who writes me letters about the flowers in her garden. I'm going to die here today, and so are you, and so are all our friends. But maybe this time we can die as human beings instead of as enemies." Hans stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle. Hans Kruger. He was a teacher before all this. They sat together in the ruins of the church as the battle raged around them. Two young men who should have been teaching children or tending gardens, sharing their last minutes of life in a moment of impossible peace. When the shell landed, and it did land, because death always found its way, they died together, hands still clasped, proof that even in hell, human connection was possible. James woke up the next morning with tears on his cheeks and hope in his heart. For the first time in 500 loops, he hadn't broken the cycle, but he had bent it. He had found humanity in the heart of inhumanity. And if he could do that once, maybe he could do it again. Maybe he could keep doing it until the very foundations of this cursed morning cracked from the weight of accumulated mercy. James McKinnon was no longer just a soldier trapped in time. He was becoming something else entirely, a force of compassion in a moment designed for hatred, a bridge between enemies who had forgotten they were human. Part 4. Breaking the chains of eternity. There comes a moment in every impossible story when the impossible becomes inevitable. For James McKinnon, that moment came on loop 999, when he realized that saving everyone might require sacrificing everything, including the very thing that made him human. Sometimes the greatest act of love is learning how to let go. The revelation came to him like dawn breaking over a blood-soaked battlefield. James had been wrong about everything. The loop wasn't a punishment or a cosmic accident or even a curse. It was a test, not of his ability to prevent death, but of his capacity to understand what death meant. Every loop, every failure, every moment of accumulated agony had been preparing him for a single terrible choice. He could break the cycle. He had always been able to break it, but the price was accepting that some battles aren't meant to be won, they're meant to be remembered. On the 1000th loop, James McKinnon woke up different. He could see them now, the threads that bound this moment in time, golden filaments of possibility that stretched from each person to every other, a web of interconnected fate so complex it made his mind ache to look at it. Tommy's thread was bright with laughter and love for his mother. Big Jim's thread pulsed with loyalty and fierce protectiveness. Peter's thread shimmered with poetry and dreams of a girl named Anna. And there, tangled around all of them like a net, was James's own thread, dark with accumulated grief, heavy with the weight of 1,000 mornings, but still somehow unbroken. He understood now why he had been chosen for this torment, not because he was strong enough to save everyone, but because he was stubborn enough to love them through every single death. The loop hadn't been trapping his friends, it had been teaching him that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes form. "Morning, McKinnon," Davies said, checking his watch. "Ready for another day in paradise?" James looked at his commanding officer, really looked at him. Davies had a daughter back home named Susan, who was learning to play piano. His wife, Margaret, had been writing him letters about the garden, how the roses were blooming despite the war. Davies carried a photograph in his breast pocket, worn soft from touching, of a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. In 37 minutes, Davies would die leading the charge, shot through the heart by a German machine gun. He would die thinking about Susan's piano lessons, wondering if she remembered the song he taught her before he left for France. "Ready as I'll ever be," James replied, but his voice carried something new. Not resignation, not desperation, acceptance. Pure, clean, devastating acceptance. He spent the morning saying goodbye. Not obvious goodbyes that would alarm his friends, but subtle ones. He listened to Tommy's stories about home with complete attention, memorizing every word. He helped Big Jim clean his rifle one last time, noting how the big man's hands were gentle despite their size. He sat beside Peter and watched him write, finally understanding that the young poet wasn't writing for Anna. He was writing for everyone who would come after, everyone who needed to know that beauty could exist even in hell. "You write beautifully," James told Peter, the words soft with finality. Peter looked up surprised. "You've never read anything I've written." "I've read all of it," James said quietly. "Every word, every letter you never sent, every poem about rain and home and the way sunlight looks through tree branches. It's beautiful, Peter. All of it." Peter stared at him with wide, confused eyes. "How could you know?" "Because," James said, standing up and shouldering his rifle, "because someone had to remember it. Someone had to carry it forward." The bombardment was ending. He could feel time condensing around them like a closing fist. In moments, Davies would give the order and they would all climb toward their destiny. But this time, James wasn't going to try to change anything. This time, he was going to perfect it. "Listen to me," he said urgently to his friends. "All of you. In a few minutes, we're going to charge that hill. Some of us won't come back, but I need you to know something." They gathered around him, Tommy with his young face and eager eyes, Big Jim with his massive frame and gentle heart, Peter with his notebook clutched against his chest like armor, his brothers, his family, his responsibility. "Whatever happens out there," James continued, "you're not dying for nothing. You're dying for the man next to you. You're dying so that someday, somewhere, children can play in gardens instead of hiding in trenches. You're dying so that poets can write about love instead of war. You're dying so that mothers can sleep peacefully instead of wondering if their sons will come home." "McKinnon, what's gotten into you?" Davies interrupted. James looked at his commanding officer and smiled, a smile that held the weight of 1,000 mornings and the love of infinite repetition. "I'm ready to remember them properly," he said. The whistle blew. They climbed the ladder together, these 5 men who had become more than brothers through the alchemy of shared suffering. But this time, James wasn't going to try to save them. Instead, he was going to honor them. When Tommy took the bullet in his chest, James was there. He caught the young man as he fell, cradled him in the shell hole where he'd always died, and this time he didn't try to stop the bleeding. Instead, he held Tommy's hand and told him about his mother, how proud she was, how she bragged to the neighbors about her brave son, how she kept his letters in a box beside her bed and read them every night. "Tell her," he gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "I'll tell her everything," James promised. "Every joke you made, every kindness you showed, every moment you chose to laugh instead of cry. She'll know who you really were." Tommy smiled and closed his eyes forever, but the smile remained. When Big Jim fell to the machine gun fire, James was there too. He knelt beside the big Irishman and spoke of Dublin, of the sister who would name her first son after him, of the legacy of courage he was leaving behind.
"Did we do good, lad?" Jim whispered, his massive hands growing still. "You did perfect," James said. "You were perfect." When Peter vanished in the mortar blast, James was close enough to catch the notebook as it flew through the air. Pages scattered like snow, like prayers, like promises. James gathered them all, every scrap of poetry and love and desperate hope. When Davies fell leading the charge, James was there to hear his last words. "Tell Susan. Tell her to keep playing piano." And when the sniper's bullet finally found James himself, when Hans Kruger squeezed that trigger for the 1,001st time, James felt something he had never felt before in all his dying: peace. Because this time, he wasn't failing to save them. He was succeeding in remembering them. As darkness closed around him, James held on to every detail.
Tommy's laugh, Big Jim's stories, Peter's poetry, Davy's love for his daughter, Hans's blue eyes, and the way his hands shook when he didn't want to kill. He held on to all of it, and as he died, something extraordinary happened. The threads of possibility that bound the moment together began to glow. James's accumulated love, his 1,000 mornings of devotion, his refusal to let his friends be forgotten, it all crystallized into something harder than time itself, a memorial, not built of stone or metal, but of memory made manifest, a place where their sacrifice would be preserved forever, where their stories would echo through eternity, where anyone who looked closely enough could see 5 young men who chose love over fear in their final moments. James McKinnon died on October 15, 1917, in a field in France, surrounded by his friends. But his death was different this time. This time it was willing. This time it was complete. And for the first time in 1,000 loops, he didn't wake up. Instead, he became something else, something larger. He became the guardian of their story, the keeper of their names, the voice that would whisper their truth to anyone willing to listen. In the real world, the world that moved forward past October 15, 1917, 5 British soldiers died in a failed charge against German positions. Their bodies were never recovered. Their families received telegrams expressing regret for their sacrifice. History forgot their names and moved on to other battles, other losses, other wars. But somewhere between what was and what might have been, in the space where love becomes stronger than death, their story lived on, preserved by a young man who chose to remember them perfectly, who loved them completely, who gave up eternity itself to ensure they would never truly die. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rises from certain battlefields in France, travelers report hearing voices, young voices, laughing and joking and telling stories of home, the voices of men who died believing their sacrifice mattered, preserved by another man who made sure it always would. James McKinnon learned that breaking a time loop isn't about changing the past. It's about accepting it so completely, so lovingly, that it transforms from tragedy into triumph. He learned that the greatest victory isn't preventing death. It's ensuring that death serves life, that sacrifice becomes sacred, that love endures beyond the boundaries of time itself. The day the war never ended became the day love never died. And in the end, that was victory enough for any soldier's heart to carry into whatever peace awaits beyond the battlefield of memory. Some loops are meant to be broken. Others are meant to be perfected. James McKinnon's loop became perfect the moment he stopped fighting it and started embracing what it had always been trying to teach him, that love is the only force stronger than time, that remembrance is the only victory that matters, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to let go of the people that matter most, no matter how much it costs your soul. The war never ended for James McKinnon. It just became something beautiful instead of something broken. And in the end, beauty is all any of us can hope to leave behind.